This morning we're going to look at Matthew chapter 18. Jesus tells a parable in answer to Peter's question about how many times should I forgive. And periodically, really on a fairly regular basis, I kind of like to just remind us about the power of forgiveness. You know, it's one of the great gifts that God gives to us through Christ, is He extends to us His forgiveness. And it is also one of those gifts that when we then extend that to another, we gift ourselves. We gift ourselves. It's kind of like a double gift. And so we're going to look at a powerful parable that Jesus tells. But I want to, before we get there, just to say that, you know, forgiveness was a theme that Jesus talked about on a fairly frequent basis. And in Matthew chapter 6, where we have what we call the Lord's Prayer, and in fact, we included that as a part of our opening of worship today, in context of what I'm going to be talking about this morning, you know, because within the Lord's Prayer is forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. At the end of that model prayer, Jesus, and there are a number of themes in that model prayer. There are a number of themes in that prayer, but Jesus returns immediately to only one of them. If you go to Matthew chapter 6 and look at the Lord's Prayer, you'll find that immediately at the conclusion of the Lord's Prayer, He cycles back to underscore one of those themes that was in that prayer: forgiveness. He talks about forgiveness. I don't know this. I'm going to speculate this. I think one of the reasons that he cycles back to just kind of re-emphasize the matter of forgiveness, that out of the themes that we can pick out from the Lord's Prayer, I think Jesus knew the most difficult one in there was forgiveness. And so I believe that's one of the reasons that right at the end of that prayer, he then does some additional teaching about forgiveness. Well, we're going to look at this amazing parable that Jesus tells and find in it 5 reasons that we ought to practice forgiveness. And so we open up there in verse 21. It says, "Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, 'Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me?'" And then he kind of seeks to answer his own question. He says, "Up to 7 times." Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Or your translation may say 70 times 7 times. Therefore," here comes the parable, "the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. At this the servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I will pay back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go." The man asked for an extension, and he got better than that. He got an outright cancellation of the debt. But when the servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me. should you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all he owed. This, Jesus says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. Wow. Pretty straightforward parable about the power of forgiveness. Not only God's, obviously, forgiveness to us, and it's not an extension, it's an outright cancellation, but what is really important, what is the heart of Jesus' message here in Matthew chapter 18, is our response to that is that you and I then are to be people who extend, bestow, grant forgiveness to others. I want to begin with just a quick working definition of what I'm going to mean by forgiveness, and then we're going to look at this parable and find in it 5 reasons that you and I ought to forgive that Jesus gives us. Working definition would be this: forgiveness is the decision. And I want to pause right there. Forgiveness is the decision. Forgiveness is not a feeling. And a lot of times, folks think that, well, I'll forgive when I feel like forgiving. Forgiveness is not a feeling. You know, I've said before, and the Bible is very clear about this, emotions, feelings, are never a good guide for us in life. Forgiveness is a matter of the will. It's a decision. It's a choice that you and I make. Forgiveness is the decision to release a person from the obligations they owe you from the injuries or offense, and you can fill in whatever word you would like, however they have harmed you, injured you, offended you. So forgiveness is the decision to release a person from the obligation they owe you for offending, injuring you, however you want to put that. Now, with that as kind of just the practical working definition of forgiveness, I want to use the parable that Jesus tells here, because again, forgiveness was a major theme of his, and when he was talking about how you and I as believers relate to one another. 5 reasons to forgive. Reason number 1, forgiveness ends the offense. I would just cycle right back to verse 26 in this parable, where the servant goes to the master. 10,000 bags of gold is what this guy owes, and he can't pay it. He's never going to be able to pay it. Certainly the implication here, he asks for an extension. He gets graciously, mercifully, a cancellation of all of that debt. In other words, it's ended. It's ended. It's been written off. It's been canceled. That's the extent, that's the depth, that's the graciousness of God's forgiveness to us, that it's ended. Forgiveness ends the offense. Now let's bring it to the relationships that you and I have and talk about how forgiveness ends the offense on the horizontal plane. Forgiveness is work. Forgiveness is unnatural. Forgiveness ends the offense if you and I do 3 things. Number 1 is, if I do not bring it up to you. By you, I mean the one that has offended me. If I don't bring that matter back up to you, that's one of 3 steps that then ends the offense. And you and I both know that in those matters where if someone has hurt us or insulted us or offended us or injured us, or again, whatever word you want to plug in, and we bring it back up to them, right? Well, if that's your practice, if that is what you and I do, then forgiveness has lost its power. The offense, the power, the influence of the offense continues. so forgiveness ends the offense if, number one, we don't bring it back up to the other person. I believe the next two are the most difficult ones of the three. You know, sometimes you and I can kind of easily not bring it up, back up to the other person because we don't want another, right? We just don't want to repeat that. So number two is you're not going to bring it up to other people. You're not going to bring it up to other people. And that is so tempting to do. When someone has insulted us or hurt us or offended us, to talk about it, to share about it, to put it out there to other people. If we engage in that kind of behavior, then the offense continues. The power and the legacy of the offense continues. Number three, you don't bring it up to yourself. You don't bring it up to yourself. I don't bring it up to me. I don't bring it up to myself. Because if I continue to bring it back up to myself, I just enable that offense and that injury and that insult, that harm, again, whatever word you want to insert, to just basically live rent-free in my spirit and in my soul, and the offense continues. Authentic forgiveness, real forgiveness, hard work forgiveness has the power, if we will do those three things, to end the offense, to make it not an extension but a true cancellation. Just what the Master did there in verse 26. Number two, forgiveness has no limits. Forgiveness has no limits. You know, left to ourselves, we can rationalize so easily why we would not forgive. Because see, what we want to do, we want to limit forgiveness. We really want to limit forgiveness. I put in this little shaded box in your worship bulletin this morning, kind of 5 big rationalizations that we will often use. We'll kind of lean into as a reason not to extend forgiveness because we want to limit it left to ourselves, and so we might say or think, you know, the effect is just big time. It's too big. It's too big. Now I can't get over that. It's too big. Well, time will take care of it. Time will take care of it. You know what? If time would take care of it, if that was true, I believe Jesus would have said that at some point in his earthly ministry. Nowhere does Jesus look at anybody who is hurting or who has been hurt and say to them, you know what, time will take care of it. Never says that. How about this one? Well, they need to say they're sorry. They need to say they're sorry. I can't forgive until I can forget. Can I just say to you that if we're going to operate upon the premise, I'm not going to forgive until I can forget, unless you're going to want and invite the onset of dementia, that's not going to happen. And by the way, I don't wish for any of you the onset of dementia. That's not the solution. Or how about this one? Well, if I forgive, they'll just do it again. If I forgive, they'll just do it again. You see, you and I, again, we want to limit forgiveness. We want to put parameters around it. We want to put boundaries around it. We want to contain it. And to find out a reason or rationalization why we don't have to extend it. And you know, when Peter, there, which kind of opens up this conversation, prompts then this parable that Jesus tells, you know, Peter kind of has that idea in mind, kind of implied within the question, right? Peter says, Lord, how many times shall I forgive a brother or sister who sins against me? Hey, how about this? 7 times. Now, Peter probably thought he was just being just so gracious and so generous coming up with the number 7, because in Jesus' day, in the first century, rabbinical thought was that you forgave 3 times. After that, you're not obligated to forgive anymore. Where does that come from? It comes from the first and second chapters of the book of Amos, where there is a list of groups of people, nations, and they have all done things that have offended God. And there's this little phrase that appears right before all the little offenses, I shouldn't say little offenses, they were big-time offenses, where it says, up to 3 times, maybe even 4. And then it talks about God's wrath. So the rabbinical thought was, well, okay, based on Amos 1 and 2, 3 is good enough. That's the magic number. Past that, don't worry about it. You're not obligated. So when Peter comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, how many times must I forgive? Up to 7 times, he may truly have been expecting Jesus to say, that's amazing. That's just amazing. And yet, if you want to go all the way to 7, that's big time gracious. Because Peter was basically taking the rabbinical number, doubling it, and then throwing an extra one in. What did Jesus say? 77 times or 70 times 7. Doesn't make any difference whether it's 77 or 490 times. The point remains the same. It's limitless. It's limitless. A second reason to forgive is that forgiveness, real, authentic, biblical, God-responding forgiveness, has no limits. Based upon the teachings of Christ, forgiveness is to be total, unilateral, and infinite. Because that is the reflection of God's forgiveness to us. Reason number 3, because I am forgiven. And really that's the heart of what is at this parable. The servant that is forgiven refuses to extend forgiveness to another, and that's really kind of where the action is in this parable. And sometimes I think that for all of us, it would really sober us up spiritually when you and I are harboring those grudges, when you and I are not wanting or refusing to extend forgiveness to another person, to really sit back and reflect and think of all the ways and all the things that God has forgiven you and God has forgiven me. And if we can really take stock of that and kind of do a good self-inventory, that can be spiritually sobering. And once we realize how deeply and infinitely and powerfully God has forgiven us, that's a third reason that you and I ought to forgive. Reason number 4. Unforgiveness injures other people. A lot of times when we think that an offense or an insult or a harm has been done, it's really just kind of between those 2 people. I want to suggest to you, based upon the teachings of Christ in this parable, unforgiveness always has collateral damage. Notice there in verse 31, it says, when the other servants, so not the 2 that are involved, when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged. So they've been impacted. Granted, indirectly, but they have been impacted. And you know what? When there is a ruptured relationship in the home, it affects everybody in the home. When there is a ruptured relationship in the workplace, it affects everybody in that workplace. When there is a ruptured relationship even within the body of Christ, it affects the body of Christ. There's a ripple effect, always a ripple effect. Unforgiveness has collateral damage. I remember a few years ago, a local funeral home called and asked if I would do a funeral for a family, and so I did. I went over to the home and met with the lady who was the daughter of the deceased, she and her husband. She was the only local family member, and so she was kind of a key point of contact for the service. And in situations like that, I was doing with her what I always do with families, getting to know a little bit about them. I did not know the deceased, so I wanted to get some information, some stories, some memories, some reflections from her on behalf of the family about the deceased, so that way I could kind of put together a service that they would like and that would be reflective of the person that was being remembered. And normally that in-home visit, or however that visit happens, in that context, it usually take about an hour and 15 minutes or so for us to kind of get the information that we need. Hour and a half in, I had as yet to hear about her father. Hour and a half of the family's dirty laundry. The husband, bless his heart, he was doing everything he possibly could when she'd take a breath to redirect the conversation. I was trying my hardest as well. It just wasn't happening. She had things she was just going to get out. Ultimately, in that visit, we kind of took care of what was on my agenda and what we kind of needed to take care of. A couple days later, the funeral happens. We're at local funeral home chapel. I'm going to come down here to illustrate this. So, as you know, in kind of a traditional funeral service, the family kind of gathers in the family room, and then the funeral director will escort them into the chapel, and I'll have everybody stand. And this was a rupture between she and a cousin. So the family comes out, I'm standing on the platform, congregation has stood. So the lady comes right here. Normally, you're going to be looking at me. She turns and looks this direction, sees what I'm assuming is the cousin come in the back. Hands go on the hips. Scowl comes across the face. Cousin walks in, takes a seat on the back seat. Now, what do you think people remembered about that funeral service? A lady sang a couple solos. She did a beautiful job. Think they remembered that? Think they remembered anything I said? Do you think they remembered any of the reflections or the memories on behalf of the family about the deceased? Unforgiveness always has collateral damage. It has an innate, natural ability to just suck people into a vortex. And so here the other servants get triangulated in here. Unforgiveness injures other people. Fifth and finally, unforgiveness destroys you. Destroys me. At the end of the parable, after the servant has been brought into the master and kind of taken to task about not showing mercy to one who owed him a debt, it says, in anger his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back what he owed. Now, I doubt that any of us are going to be, handed over to jailers and be tortured as a result of unforgiveness. By the way, if you are, I will come see you. I'll come visit you. Be your pastor. I don't think that's going to happen, but I will tell you this. There is torture to the spirit when unforgiveness eats at your soul, at my soul. This past week, I followed a little bit, kind of off and on, the whole sentencing of James D'Angelo out in California. He was the Golden State Killer. And in the 1970s through the mid-1980s, he ultimately confessed to 13 murders, assaults against 56 women, over 11 counts. He just got caught in 2018 DNA. So, as is the custom, the victims or the victim's family members could address the court before the judge imposed sentencing. That process in this case, because of the number of people involved, took 3 days. Took 3 days. You can only begin to imagine, if you didn't see any of this, just snippets on news or whatever, of the raw emotion, the bitterness, the anger, as family member after family member, victim after victim, just poured it out in the courtroom while looking at this guy. He never looked at that. The Los